Good morning.
Morning, Skura.
Morning.
Good morning.
Thank you so much, colleagues, for joining again. This morning we have Dr. Kira Erwin speaking to us. I'm going to introduce her and she will go through the presentation. Dr. Kira Erwin is a sociologist, researcher, and scholar activist who, over the past 12 years, has supported social and environmental justice struggles in her home city of Durban. She is the monitoring evaluation research and learning coordinator at Groundwork, an environmental justice organization working across numerous justice issues locally and globally. Before that, Kira was an associate professor at the Urban Futures Center at DUT. She is also a member of the Durban Coalition, a coalition of civic society, social movements, and civic structures working together to address social justice and climate resilience in the city. Dr. Erwin, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the lovely introduction, and hello everyone. I'm really pleased to be with you here today. In fact, looking forward a lot to learning with all of you because I know there's a lot of expertise in this room, and definitely things I have to learn about this very challenging aspect of how we keep ourselves safe during an age of climate change. So today I'm going to be speaking. I am based at Groundwork, exactly as was introduced, but Groundwork is a member of the Durban Coalition. So I wanted to tell you a story of how the Durban Coalition came to be and why we wanted to focus on the right to housing in an age of climate change. And then just discuss a little bit the role of the built environment professionals in thinking through climate resilience. This is very much from a community civil society driven process. And then after questions and answers, I am very open. I really would like to hear from yourselves. I'm sure people are thinking in this area already, and there may well be some innovative technologies that we haven't thought of yet, which would be great for us to think through. So I'm going to start with a story, and for those of you that live in Durban or the surrounding area, it's probably a story that you experienced. And that is when a particular weather phenomenon known as a cut-off low system arrived in our city over 2 days, in which we experienced, some of the most devastating infrastructure damage, loss of lives from extreme flooding. What, you might have seen rather sensationally, but also accurately was called a rain bomb, when an extraordinary amount of water comes down onto your city in a very short period of time, and the kinds of devastation that happened. What was, I suppose, in one way, slightly unifying for the city of Durban is that these floods didn't discriminate in an already very unequal city. They hit different areas as hard. So informal settlements, devastated if you're living in shacks. But we also saw significant damage as well in very well-off areas like Umhloti and Umhlanga. So whether it was business or residents, what happened during this time was not a 2 day event, but for some people ended up being a 3 to 6 months experience of being cut off from critical infrastructure. And this really, I think, is the challenge that we face, that with extreme weather events, when they happen, how resilient are we in terms of water, waste, electricity, if we're going to be in situations where we can face no water for 6 months after a flooding event like this, then we're in trouble in the city. This is a Toyota plant in the South Durban Basin, and I will come back to this, but you can see what happened to its container plant as massive amounts of water move those containers almost like small ships into the highway. Of course, if you were living in an informal settlement, the level of sort of total destruction of homes and loss of lives, and extraordinarily scary incidents that happened for people when water levels moved so quickly, to take over people's homes. So we've been working in the Durban Coalition with some of South Africa's best climate modelers because the president came down after those Durban floods in 2022 and asked the question, or actually stated that this was because of climate change. But the climate modelers wanted to prove this so that it wasn't just a statement. And it's a paper worth reading, actually, to say that definitely the heating of the planet and especially the oceans made this a significantly worse, almost 40% worse event than would have happened, even 50 years ago if such a weather system had come over our city. So for many people, it's the worst flood that they can remember. We have had devastating floods in Durban before, but the economic toll sitting up in 3.6 billion US dollars. But these are the numbers that I would like us to start to think about. 140,000 people impacted and 42,000 people displaced. 544 people lost their lives. Those are the ones we know of over those 2 days. And these numbers that we are seeing here, this is the kind of challenge. When 42,000 people get displaced in 2 days, what do you do as a city? What is local government's role? So what I'm going to talk about now is what did civil society do? So for many people working in different sectors in the civil society and civic structures like ratepayers and residents committees, it was a critical moment for us. What we saw is that, look, the city wasn't in a great space before the floods hit. Lots of infrastructure was already weakened. There hadn't been systematic maintenance of this infrastructure, which meant when the floods hit, it was exacerbated, the kinds of destruction that you'd seen. And we had heard that National Treasury was opening R1 billion to come down to eThekwini to fix the infrastructure damage. As I said before, there was lots of people still without electricity, without access to water, etc. And I think our concern was, how would we guarantee that if that kind of money came down to the city level for infrastructure repair, that not only did it repair infrastructure, but could it actually do it in a way that also addressed inequality? Because fixing a city and putting it back to the kind of broken state that it was in before wasn't really a viable option. In addition, and I will speak honestly here, we were really concerned around the levels of corruption that were happening in local government here. That round about the same time, an Auditor General report came out showing large and significant flows of money leaving the city through tenders in illegal ways. So the Durban Coalition brought together ratepayers, residents associations, social movements in the city, and civil society NGOs, community-based organizations, really in response to these floods. So the concern was so deep that it brought together people to ask ourselves, what do you do when your city feels like it is teetering on the brink? How do we work with local government? How do we reach out to them again? How do we say, look, we have to work together? There's no ways you can continue as business as usual. And more importantly, how are you planning for another event like this so that we don't see what we saw? So I'm going to tell you today about the process of a participatory plan that we've ended up developing called the People's Plan for the Right to Housing in an Age of Climate Change. And I'm showing this process flow very intentionally because one of the things about local government is that, especially in planning, it really doesn't allocate enough time or budget for proper participation. I'm sure many of you might have even been in situations like this where, a consultant or a city official stands up in a community hall and shows a plan that has already really been decided, and the consultation is just a checklist. There's increasing frustration about that. So we wanted to actually model and learn what does it take to run a participatory planning process. And you can see that it takes time, right? The first gathering we have, and that's a listening gathering. In fact, even before that, we had lots of bilateral meetings with different sectors in civil society and with local government officials as well. The first process really was just to listen, to not come with any solutions, but to hear from different groups living across our city. What was it like during those floods? What were the concerns? What were the issues before? What were the issues afterwards? It was a robust debate and conversation, and those are also necessary. You know, people could challenge each other. Uh, there were informal settlement social movements like Abishlali, Basamjondoro, and Shaktwedas International, you know, openly asking ratepayers associations, why don't you allow social housing in your area? You know, the politicians are telling us it's because you don't want us. They can't build temporary shelter for us. Those conversations are important to have, and I think for the first time they were happening directly between groups rather than sometimes being mediated by politicians who, you know, on purpose or unintentionally can actually sow quite deep divisions in a city around things like that, often as a kind of excuse for not delivering. So after this listening gathering, we moved to a solidarity session, and this is really where professionals such as yourselves have been an enormous help. We had our Durban Coalition members. We had like the Saatchi chair of urban planning from WITS. We had environmental specialists. We had architects from Durban in that room too, who helped us take the themes that had emerged and really start to develop some rich content to say, what would a program or project look like if we were to start to build resilience in the city? So I'm going to come back to the critical role of technical and professional expertise and how we can really try and move to bring them much closer to people on the ground so that people can start to take action in their own areas. So after this, it allowed us to have a draft of a document. And you can see, of course, there was more going, even again, speaking to city officials to try and understand some of their constraints, speaking to different organizations to make sure, did we hear you right? Is this what you were saying? Once that draft was done, we did what's called a ground truthing exercise. So each of the big organizations or sectors took that draft and went and took it out to their members or the people that are part of their organization or to their neighbors in the area and workshopped it so that we really got a sense of, you know, did it capture what people thought was important for a city to do? And for us particularly, we were aiming this and pushing it to be in the integrated development plan for eThekwini. That's one thing that we learned quickly, that if there is no budget, if it's not in the IDP, there won't be a budget. So we had a strategy of wanting to get this plan incorporated into the integrated development plan. Here you can see this is at a big Abishlali AGM where the People's Plan draft has been presented to get feedback. So once we had a final draft, and local government officials also had a look at that draft too, and that was important, mostly in human settlements and in planning departments, we managed to convince eThekwini to launch the People's Plan with us. And this is also important, the People's Plan, and maybe, Kara, you can put a link in the chat so people could download the plan and have a look at it, is both in English and in isiZulu. And we thought that was really important. eThekwini's IDP, not this current one, but the last one, was over 1,000 something pages and only in English. So it's not really an easy document for ordinary people to engage with. And we wanted something that was shorter, clearer, and in both languages. So the People's Plan really has 4 pillars, and some of these are really important, I think, for the area of work that you are all in. The first is climate resilient human settlements, and I will go through some of these in more detail in a minute. The second is really starting to plan around displaced people. You will see later the number of people who are displaced in Mozambique recently as well, and Limpopo. If you aren't planning for that, to be honest, in cities around the world, coastal cities, if you aren't planning for how you handle temporary displacement due to severe weather and flooding, you're asking for a crisis. And quite frankly, our city is already in one. So even people who lost their homes in 2022, mostly, but not only from informal settlements, some of them living in private homes along the riverbank, are still living in so-called temporary accommodation in very dilapidated buildings. There's been times where there's been no water in those buildings. So you almost create a human rights issue if you don't plan properly around temporary housing for disasters. We put on the table that if we were going to do this, we needed to do it together. So we needed new governance frameworks. How do business, faith-based organizations, civil society, educational institutes, and government come together to really think through what it means to plan for resilience in our city? I'm pleased to say that this municipal climate, we had called it a high-level working group. This has actually now been formed. So eThekwini has created the Municipal Forum for Climate Change, and the Durban Coalition holds 2 seats on that. So far, it's just had a launch, but we are hoping that this can be a space where we can push for more action in some of the other pillars. We've also asked for an integrated human settlement forum. This is critical. You really can't have a situation anymore where government is making promises to people in informal settlements, promises to people in hostels, promising another thing to ratepayers, in suburbs, etc. Like we said, no, there's got to be a space where people can come together and you can actually have a much more strategic focus around integrated human settlements. So governance and new governance frameworks is important for this. For us, I can say that we are hoping that more professional, technical-minded people, such as architects, planners, engineers, actually want to start getting involved even in these governance frameworks. We see them as critical skills in those discussions. And the last pillar, if you want, or tree, is expanding security of tenure. So I'm going to touch on some of these today, not all of them, but if you're interested in seeing what a coalition of civil society has put on the table for its municipality to action with it, because I'll say that's important. We're not saying this is only the job of the municipality. You're welcome to look at the PDF. So end of 2024, we're very excited. We had a joint launch with the eThekwini municipality. We had people from province, from national. We had the Presidential Climate Commission spokesperson there. And we presented what we thought was a really integrated and holistic plan for the right to housing in an age of climate change. It took a while, and I won't go too much into the details of that. There was a sort of verbal promise that it should be in the IDP. It took a little bit more struggles and negotiations, but finally, in the IDP review 2025-26, the People's Plan, at least there was a commitment to say to different departments, you must engage, on these sorts of arrangements, on these sorts of programs, etc. Of course, that doesn't mean that it's going to get implemented overnight, and we are still very much pushing in different ways for parts of projects or programs to be implemented. But the nice thing about civil society is that they're not that naive. They're not going to sit at home and wait for government to fix something for them. I think they've had a long history of realizing that there are moments where, you're on your own. And one of the things that had often come up in discussions around that experience of the floods in 2022 was just how alone people felt. They did not, of course, this is not across the city, but in many areas, they did not see local government respond. They did not see disaster response coordinated by the state. And who had responded were neighbors, your own community. So first responders were the people that you lived with, who or shopkeepers or owners of petrol stations or the church up the road or the mosque or the temple. So, those were the immediate responders in the disaster. And then very quickly, you would have other civil society responses. Many of you would have heard of like Gift of the Givers, but there were many others. And I must say the faith-based networks, they are really coordinated around this as well. Disaster management in the city was run off their feet. I mean, it wasn't a case that they didn't respond. It's just that there's no ways they could have responded to the scale that happened. And so you had a sense from people of feeling a bit abandoned by local government during this time. However, community-led disaster management and climate change, in response to climate change, is definitely something that communities can lead themselves. So the Durban Coalition has worked since then, this was last year, to build more capacity amongst communities and civil society to learn about disaster preparedness, planning, response, etc. What does it mean to be prepared ourselves for the next disaster? And part of that has also been bringing the scientists into the room. Here you can see Francois Engelbrecht. If you haven't heard of him, look him up. He is increasingly a very well-known scientist internationally who is doing the climate modeling, and whose models show that for the first time, these big sort of AI-generated modeling that happens is starting to show the possibilities of cyclones actually coming as far down and hitting Durban itself. Definitely Richards Bay. So no longer will the cyclones only be up in Mozambique, which is what we've been used to. Increasingly, the models show them moving further south, which means that, it's fairly urgent. We need to start moving on this. So these kinds of things, bringing people together, sharing understanding, sharing different expertise, whether it's expertise in the community, understandings of how people would respond to certain disasters, or expertise from fire, water, built environment. People really need these spaces to start to learn because no one has all the answers. Okay, so what we are working on now is in 3 high priority areas, thinking about what it would take to create neighborhood emergency teams, because that is the reality of who responds when disaster strikes. And if there's questions on that, I'm happy to speak more on that a bit later. All right, I think I've said this a few times, but just to say that, what scientists are telling us is, no, you should really be prepared, because what's coming is potentially more rainfall in short periods of times. And that is the most dangerous, especially for infrastructure, but of course also for loss of lives. So there are certain procedures that start to become critical that in some ways require government to lead, but only if they are able to really engage and do this in a participatory way with people on the ground. One is early warning systems. You may have seen a lot of stuff about this recently. How do you warn people in time? The second is that even if you warn people in time, what must they do? How do people actually leave places that become dangerous? So what does evacuation look like? In Mozambique, these recent floods, Mozambique can evacuate around 45,000 people, and you will see that their death toll, even though the flooding was worse, is lower than what happened in eThekwini. Now, in Mozambique, they've got a long-standing partnership with the Red Cross. So their civil society is assisting to move people out of harm's way. These are big planning processes that cities really need to get their heads around. Okay, so yep, as I was saying, Mozambique and Limpopo, you know, it was sad for us to watch, actually quite painful, because we've done all this work on trying to think through how we prepare here, and then to watch your neighbor and even parts of South Africa undergo a floods of a kind that they hadn't seen, you know, for some people in their entire lifetime. But again, I want to look at the numbers. So 620,000 people needed assistance in these latest floods. It's staggering, these kinds of numbers. So how do we plan for that? What kinds of preparation can we do? And why it's important, I think, especially for architects, but also for town and regional planners, is that your first thing that you need to do for displaced people is shelter. So, you know, what does that look like? Where is it? Are there ways that you could retrofit places so that they could very quickly become a disaster center and then, you know, scale back down when it isn't needed, etc. So we're really looking at yeah, the ability to be more flexible around what buildings become what during disasters. Of course, the second thing around the built environment is when your road infrastructure is damaged, you immediately move into a crisis of food security or food sovereignty where people can't actually access goods. That includes medical attention, for example. And for a second, I want to talk about the roles of dams. Now, I know that that's more an engineer's job, but what we've seen both here in this area and in those Durban floods is that when dams are not maintained and there hasn't been enough thought to how a dam would handle the kinds of liters of water that suddenly happen during this flooding, it actually creates a worse flood. So in the South Durban Basin, you'll remember the picture of Toyota and all those containers onto the highway. What actually happens there is that a dam sluice breaks because of the pressure upstream. And the water that was already rising through flooding just becomes like a wall that comes down from the dam. It just literally removes everything in its way. So preparing to be climate resilience really means thinking about, you know, who's looking after the dams? How can a dam handle this? Because anyone who's downstream from a dam that isn't being properly maintained or engineered to handle this kind of excess water is at more risk than other people. Okay, so how can professionals and technical skills assist us in this? How do we find a way to bring this kind of knowledge? And as I said, I would really, really love to learn from all of you at the end. I hope very much. Yeah, we know some things, but we certainly aren't experts in this. So I just want to focus a little bit and give some idea of what people are asking for. And as you saw that process, that was around 14 months of speaking to people across the city. Here's what we think would be really useful to do, and we can't do it alone. So the first thing is Project 1 under Program 2, which is building climate resilience and human settlements, is to start drafting new and expanded norms and standards that really think about what is needed before building happens. And this we suggest should be not just in the private, but also the public sector. So can you start, we know there's an issue with compliance, not everyone will comply, but could we start to regulate better around how people are building? And this is not just for flooding, but also for extreme heat. We've just come through a bit of a heat wave. If you speak to the public health specialists, they will tell you that heat waves are what they call the silent killers. You will be able to track, you know, excess deaths during periods of sustained heat. It is a danger, and it's a huge cost to the public healthcare system as well. So if we're not safe in our homes from excess heat, then we are also in for a tough time, because in my city, in many of your cities where you live, the two things that will happen for South Africa is extreme flooding and extreme heat. So, of course, the norms and standards, should focus on what kinds of building materials used, etc. But we also want to start thinking around decentralizing infrastructure. And why is that important? It's important because of what we learned during these floods. You do get a kind of fracturing of your ability to flow and move when severe disasters hit. That means that, instead of thinking about centralized services which get totally disrupted, how can you very quickly supply water, electricity to this neighborhood if it's been cut off from others? So here we want to start thinking about, and there are lots of people doing this, and I'm sure you know many more things too. Like, how quickly could a neighborhood set up a solar panel to power at least a fridge, so that if it's a really bad disaster, people who are taking medication that requires refrigeration, which many do for chronic medication, could come and store it there. So at least their health is taken care of, for example. Who in the community has been trained up to install such a solar power, or has some technical know-how on how to fit it or fix it, etc. We want to start thinking about what it looks like to think in more modular terms in terms of infrastructure. If you don't have access to water, which people in Tonga here didn't have access to water for, I think 5 or 6 months after those floods, can you provide, instead of water tankers, which then became an entire corruption scandal on its own, about who got water, who didn't, who started to have to pay to get that water in tankers. You could set up community level purification processes around water. I've seen at UCT, and I'm sure in many of the universities around our country, students and their lecturers are already thinking about this. What does it mean to keep a shack cool? Some of our partners and members in the Durban Coalition, for example, Project Empower, has done research with heat buttons where people touch the button and it takes a reading in the shack. Those readings will make you really concerned. I mean, people are living in sort of mini ovens. The temperatures inside shacks, because of the material being used, is dangerous for old people, for children, and for anyone who really has any organ complications. So how can we build low-cost methods that reduce the heat? Here in flooding, although sadly that stopped, and we can talk about that and why too. But what used to happen is that when shacks were washed away with floods, the local government would actually provide materials so people could rebuild. But often it's this kind of roofing, as you see it here in the picture of the white shack. And that does exacerbate heat. So is that the right material? What could you do? Should we start painting it, etc.? I see in the chat already someone has spoken about sponge cities, and of course you're absolutely right. China is leading the innovation in this. How do you have a much broader design for your entire city? Are you paying attention to how water moves in it, how it can be absorbed in it, etc.? And how do we take these kinds of innovations and retrofit them for our context here? So the second project, which this is really where we need some help, we want to learn. What we can't see is that someone has a perfect answer, right? We already have such complicated issues around providing houses and thinking about service delivery and informal settlements, etc. But could we choose three in our city? An informal settlement that's really vulnerable to flooding, a hostel block, so you're talking density, and maybe some rental stock of RDP houses. And could we pilot with the city to say, how do you retrofit this for climate resilience. So this is, you have to use the infrastructure that's already there. Can you retrofit it so that it could take extreme heat and flooding? And here we're inspired by thinking through some of the sort of huge urban challenges of places like Lagos in Nigeria. The density in Lagos is just at a scale you can't even imagine in certain areas. And now when they want to lay infrared fiber for internet access, it's almost impossible to dig up the pavement. Like the amount of people that you would have to move whilst you put in new infrastructure means they have to totally reconceptualize where infrastructure is put. Do you build up, for example? So these are the kinds of challenges I think that we'd really appreciate input into and thinking through how we can do this. And the reality is how we can do this with very little funding and resources, because you do not have municipalities here who have the resources and even sometimes the processes to undergo these sorts of pilots to learn from. But they can be willing partners, I think, and that's important. Okay, so just moving towards the sort of ending a little bit here, but we're going to open up for conversation. There's a few key takeaways, and you've heard me mention quite a few as we've gone. Okay, severe weather events are exacerbated by global warming. This is not a future anymore. They are already here. And they are already here, particularly in coastal cities such as ours. So we have to strengthen urban governance and urban planning to ensure that we retrofit our cities to save people, plants, and animals who live in them. Really, I think it's urgent, it's beyond urgent. In our city, we have got climate action plans. We even have climate resilience plans. What we are not seeing is implementation. So now is a moment for all of us, I would say, to grab the hand of local government and start to force them to work with us to implement. Kindly, of course, not through violence. So strong civil society leadership and real and meaningful participatory processes, they can be led by non-state actors, and they can be important drivers for resilience planning and preparedness. Abishlali Basamjondolo, let me tell you, is doing some incredible work in this. And their president, President Sabuza Kode, recently presented at a large human settlements conference, a national one, with the Department of Human Settlements. Same as what I've done now. He's taking the people's plan there. He's like, we are thinking about this. So that myth that people in informal settlements don't understand climate change, aren't worried about environmental issues for them, I'm afraid that's quite simply not true. Those are the people who are the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, and who are feeling the effects of this immediately and now. So part of why I'm here today is because we also think we must engage dedicated built environment professionals. We need your skills, we need your understanding, we need to understand the lenses through which we can start to think about this, but at a decentralized way in which communities start to learn some of these skills to keep themselves safe and to prepare and plan. And I've said it many times, but I do believe it, like, effective partnerships between the state and civil society are critical in moments of transition and change. This does require hard work and a lot of building of trust, but that is the work that must be done. And lastly, I am at Groundwork and we are an environmental justice organization. And so I do have to say this too, that we should be pushing to defossilize our economies and fast, because if we're planning to deal with these sorts of events and yet allowing the kinds of activities, the human-centered activities that simply make our planet warmer and warmer, then what you're planning for today, something worse is coming tomorrow. So instead of, only sort of having this focus around loss of jobs, I think we've got to be a little bit more creative here, a little bit more brave, a little bit more willing to think through this problem because defossilizing our economies actually means we save lives in critical urban infrastructure. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that wasn't too long, and I'm excited to hear what people have to say.
Thank you so much, Dr. Erwin. I think you've reminded us of a context as architects that we must always be aware of when we practice. We exist in a larger society, and our work fits in that. So thank you so much for the presentation. I wanted to find out with housing, for example. Have you had any experience with adaptive reuse of buildings? Let me tell you why I'm asking. In Durban, we have such a potential, huge potential for that, in terms of the hijacked buildings that we have. Instead of just only focusing on innovative new housing and sprawl, etc., right in the city, because remember, people want to be close to services, want to be close to jobs, etc. In your experience, what has been that potential for us as a city?
Yeah, thanks. I think that's an excellent point, and I mean that is I think a very hard and direct and necessary question to the municipality, but as well as province. Because if you look around the city, you will see that there are a lot of blocks that are actually owned by local government that are sitting derelict now. And that kind of neglect of infrastructure is a real issue. And I agree with you that those could be repurposed and quite quickly. I mean, look, let me say that for people sitting in the municipality, this is not an easy question for a number of reasons. The dealing with repurposing a building and then using it, even let's say for temporary shelter, right? Because often the people who require temporary shelter are people who already had very little. So if you move from, let's say, Umlazi behind the mega mall, right? You were living in a shack and you move into the inner city and you're giving temporary shelter. What does a municipality then do to provide you with your housing? Do you return to the same area? Do you return to an informal settlement? Or now does the state have the responsibility to house you through other mechanisms? So I don't want to pretend these are easy questions, but I agree with you, right? That is absolutely right. And so you'll see in the People's Plan, we often talk about this thing of retrofitting, and we're meaning exactly what you're saying. Like instead of trying to build new, can we take stock of what we have and see how we could change it to make it fit for purpose? So thanks.
Correct. Absolutely. And then on the People's Plan, could you please just talk further about Project 3? I find it quite interesting. Pilot a collective land ownership model in the city for informal dwellers who are already organized and working communally. Could you please just elucidate on that further?
Yeah, sure. So there's a number of reasons why that's important. Number one, collective land ownership is actually important for many people. It's a way of wanting to practice how you live in a community. In informal settlements, people have started to practice in ways in which they are building urban farms, both with animals and with growing food. But they're not protected. That land is not protected in the sense that no one who lives in an informal settlement is living in land that's protected for them. If you don't hold security of tenure, there's always a threat of evictions. But where you see people already doing this, right? For many of us, we feel this is what municipalities should immediately support. The reason for that is that not just that it offers you food sovereignty, which means that you can feed yourself and your family, but access to food during moments of disaster is like priority 2 after shelter. How can you eat? So if you leave places that are already growing food at a neighborhood scale, and this is really one thing we kept thinking, how can you think at a neighborhood scale, right? If you leave those places as precarious, you actually exacerbate a recovery period after a disaster. What you should be doing is you should securing it. You make sure that that particular community who is making and growing food in this area is safe. So collective tenure is something that you can do legally, in the constitution, but often it's thought of as happening in rural areas. And we want to start encouraging it to think about urban areas because cities actually need small farms. That's what they need right there where people are living. So again, that notion of when disaster hits, it fractures your flow of goods and services. How do you secure processes that can very quickly respond to immediate need in the location that it's needed? I hope that answers.
Yeah. It's very important, subsistence farming, to be able to reach out
Yeah.
in your backyard and grab something.
Yes. And if you want to understand the politics of that better, then reach out to Abishlali Basum John Dolo because I've learned an enormous amount from working with them. And there are other arguments for that too, which is that the private ownership of land can be a type of violence in its own. And there should be at least the opportunity for people to own collectively, especially if they're doing something productive like the growing of food.
Very amazing. Okay, thank you so much. Colleagues, could we open the platform now for questions and further discussion? Key to this, Dr. Erwin, is that as humans, we definitely cannot put away the importance of living together, of being considerate, of because in terms of disaster, you need that. Beyond the legislation and everything else. In fact, our legislation must be encouraging us to do that. Mike? Mike, I think you are muted.
Sorry, Skura. Morning,
Sure.
Kira. I think you may well know my daughter quite well, Jo Dawes. I just wondered, I didn't pick up all the members of the coalition. Is business included in that? Business chambers or whatever?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And yes, your daughter, I certainly know. And she was one of the incredibly helpful officials that actually was with us at that listening session when we started this and has been someone who's been really supportive. So thank you to her. We had a long discussion about this when we sort of started to grow as a coalition. Like, do we bring business in? We haven't yet. However, we have argued that in these kinds of new governance frameworks that we are requesting, that business is critical and must be there. Must be there. So we see an important role for business, but as of yet haven't necessarily brought them into members of the coalition. I'm sure you can imagine as well that even the building of this coalition took a lot of time, and we had ratepayers as well as, refugee social services, Shack Dwellers International, as I said, Abishlali was there, the hostel dweller units. So we had to really build a lot of trust and grow solidarity that felt real between members first. there's the positionality in terms of class, race, even sort of who has access to what government officials is so varied in the membership that it was important that we moved quite slowly to establish a strong coalition before we really started to push for what we wanted. So I think that bringing in business too early can make that quite difficult because, understandably, business has an agenda that it needs fulfilled as well. Whether that's a discussion we should open again in the coalition is something we can take to the members, but there's no doubt that business is a critical partner here.
Yeah, I'm just raising it, and I see my esteemed colleague, who was my client, Erwin Reddy. There used to be, and this was when I was younger, so it's a few years ago, it used to be called the DFR Fund, Durban Functional Region Fund. And basically that was rating, because Durban was split up into a whole lot of councils. It wasn't a metro.
That's right. Yeah.
And business used to pay a levy. And that levy was there to supplement, let's call them peripheral areas to the metro. And then at some particular point, government, I think it was, can't remember quite when it happened, but government decided, no, that wasn't necessary. They would fund it from the central funding. But what Durban did, and it was encouraged, in fact, there was a business, it's called Operation Jumpstart, and people will swear at me for mentioning that word again. It was really concerned professionals in the 80s, mid-80s, who were worried about where the country was going. PW wagging his figure on the steps on the City Hall, telling everybody where to go. And we came up with an idea that this money, which was decided to be let's ring fence that money in Durban. Let's continue to collect it, but not stop it, but ring fence it. And that fund was used to fund the major projects, included Cater Manor, the redevelopment in Cater Manor, and significant improvements. ICC Durban, funded ICC Durban, The Point, a couple of other major projects. And the question that has always sort of existed in my mind is, why did we stop? The big plus about it also was that it was money that was administered by the council treasury in terms of collections, and there's so much in the pot and things like that. But the actual expenditure was not through council media, and this was long before supply chain management and their methods. So there was a far more responsive way that procurement could happen. So when you talk about innovation and things like that, with respect to going through supply chain management, I think you'll be my age by the time it gets approved. Yep. But if we had something like what I call Operation Jumpstart, and people I think might have been Skuru who said one day, why don't we call it Operation Restart? It was 1985, 40 years ago, whatever it is. So it's about time to get it going again. But I'm just putting it there as a mechanism to get business involved and to respond to for business to respond to the social responsibility obligations that they could, and do something practical and real.
Absolutely.
And also get GG Alcock involved, please. I'll keep quiet now.
Thanks, Mark. And no, I think it's important to raise that because, you heard me say it too, that there's no point in sitting and waiting and hoping that government alone is going to solve this. It's not. So we do need something like that, and maybe that's something I can pick up with you separately. I want to say too that innovation in finance is also going to be critical, exactly as you say. Business is in a unusual situation here of being potentially a type of real, not savior, but potentially going, okay, you know what, we see our bigger role in society and let's step in and work with people on this. We know it's happened before and it should happen again. On the other hand, what this means for business in terms of ensuring their own infrastructure during severe weather events is a whole nother kettle of fish that local government is going to have to get its head around. You may have seen in the news that Toyota's insurers are busy taking eThekwini municipality to court for a lot of money because they say that what happened to Toyota was also negligence due to not maintaining infrastructure.
Yeah.
They're not wrong.
No,
But
precisely.
on the other hand, it will really be to the detriment of all of us if a huge insurance house that is already cracking lots and lots of profit every year manages to take money from a local municipality. Legally, it will be open season on all our municipalities, and they do not have the money to support insurance like that. And quite frankly, if there's millions and millions going to be funneled somewhere, it should be funneled into creating projects around climate resilience, not keeping an insurance company's pockets nice and fat. So these things are really complicated around finance and a very important issue to think through. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Gary. I think I mentioned G.G. Alcock and his, I'm sure you're aware of him, his Casonomic theory, and the interesting thing is that the founder of Capitec Bank, I think it's some Gerrit Farid, who's recently, he and G.G. Alcock are on the same page as far as finance is concerned, in terms of, how do you, G.G. Alcock deals with the informal economy, which he says is 300 to 600 billion a year. And, how are houses financed on non-proclaimed land? It's all there. The system is all there. It doesn't need reinventing. It just needs piggybacking. Just please come and talk to us. This is what you give us a plan and let's get on with it and try it. And let's not go through iterations of let's put it in place, do it, and then if it needs a panel beating for whatever, panel beat it. Don't accept it as being 100%. But good luck.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mike. Any other comments, colleagues? Questions? We will certainly be in touch, Dr. Erwin, because as the institute, we always try to make connections with other organizations. We've had interaction with Slum Dwellers International a number of times, and we would certainly going forward like to partner with you to have our skill out there as well when we formulate such plans. Greg? Greg McQueen, I think I saw your hand.
That was me, Scora. Sorry, in Poop we share links.
I can go ahead.
It's Richard Stretton. Sorry, Scora. Morning, everybody. Clearly, too much to be said. Clearly, so much to be said about this, ranging from private development organizations in Mhloti being totally responsible for under planning their water management on their development at Mhloti, directly causing massive damage, and then very surreptitiously through media turning that blame onto the municipality for not doing enough checks and balances. The kind of, like, oh, I broke the law, but actually it's the municipality's fault because they didn't catch me. This kind of nonsense that happens. And the fact that, as we are seeing in the world right now, very large and powerful people seem to get away with the most dire crimes without checks and balances because institutionally we're unable to deal with it. I completely agree with Kira. The only way to fix this is from the ground up, is to and almost ignore the power that exists. We need to move away from those things. We need to find ways to finance them separately, and we need to build independence and resilience into communities. Andrew Macon always talks about Mexico as an incredibly successful social environment, notwithstanding the deep corruption that happens at a very high level in the country. So we need to move away from, surely we need to develop ways of making communities more resilient, making them valuable, understanding the value of the KZNomics, as Mike says, and growing things despite our state, and really leaving the state to catch up. Another thing I liked what Mike said was Kevin Calverwell, when he spoke in Durban in like 2015, 2016, talked about radical incrementalism. You don't fix things with one grand stroke. The big mistake we make is we put a lot of consultants in a room to come up with a mega solution, read the north of Durban. And what we end up with is things that are intrinsically unjust, with such inflexible systems put in place that they're not even able to grow, to adjust as times change. We live in a completely different world that we lived in 10 years ago, and our plans take 20 years to evolve. There's a real arrogance that happens in the professional world in this country. There's a real lack of humility. Educated people come with an incredibly top-down attitude. We are technologically obsessed with being modern and new, and really the only way to turn that around is to sit down, listen carefully, and work slowly with an understanding of what the future might look like through modeling. One other thing I want to say, which is absolutely fascinating, Skura, which speaks to what you were saying about adaptive reuse. There was a project put out in London where they decided they needed 250,000 new small dwellings in the city of London, and they couldn't find the space of it. We were attending an online seminar on AI and architecture 2 weeks ago in the office, and the most interesting speaker was this person who used AI to map the city of London to find small developable sites to interweave small housing into the city. They came up with 800,000 sites in the city of London. And the way they were able to do that was the use of AI. We do need to embrace technology to do this, and we do need to seriously look at replanning our city and stop housing people in more remote areas and bring people into the inner city. The late Paul Weiger's plan that he did for our city was a really, really interesting piece of work. People should study that thing more. Have a lekker weekend, everybody.
Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Richard.
Further comments, colleagues? Further questions? So, Kira, in your view, where to from here for people in our space in terms of practicing architecture, fitting into the bigger picture? I think talks like this for us make us aware of what is around us, what context we're practicing in, where to from here for us as a fraternity.
Yeah, thanks. I will happily put my email in the chat. The Durban Coalition actually has a members meeting next week. What we do there is we reassess where we are with the People's Plan. As I said, there has been some movement, and really get to grips with the scope of work that we will be doing collectively. So, yeah, I'm very happy for people to connect in, especially around those pilots that we want to test. Some of the stuff I'd say in those pilots, remember, those are around trying to create neighborhood emergency teams, is really thinking at a neighborhood scale around what kinds of infrastructure you would need. But infrastructure at that scale is not a building always. It can be a device, as you said, like what does a community disaster kit look like? And who holds it? Like which church, which mosque, which temple, which school, so that if it happens, people know where to gather and the community disaster management kit can get used. Some of the, when you, Richard spoke about listening to people, like why it's so important is because there's stuff that you don't even think about. I mean, some of the stories, they're not easy stories to hear. They're very painful stories. But in that Umlazi Canal area where lots of people lost their lives, people told us about how they had attempted to save people from the flood water, especially this older woman. And the only thing they had on hand to send out to her was a electric cable. Okay, it's disconnected, so the problem is not electricity. The problem is that when you are trying to grip onto something metal and it's wet, it's slippery. So they lost her. So, like for example, is a community disaster kit, does it have a big Hessian rope? These are things that people, don't have access to, but could use in a disaster, etc. So the level at which we're thinking this year is really at a neighborhood level. And neighborhoods, as we all know and experience here, can be very diverse in South Africa. So how do we build the connections, the social connections between, people living in the neighborhood who do have some access to resources and people who don't, but specifically around a response to preparing for disasters and then responding to them before, the professional teams who can come and can do that. So that's our focus. We are also focusing, we have had a legal scholar, thankfully, come and do work looking at the Climate Change Act and the Disaster Management Act, because they are not speaking to each other. The thing about finance and how you move money and how you actually make funds available in a municipality in the Disaster Management Act is partly why you see such poor disaster responses. It's really not clear whose mandate, whose responsibility, whose budget, etc. So we're going to be pushing for that too. I would be happy to even come back to you and say, this is what members would be interested in speaking to architects who are interested in speaking to us about, if you'd like, and perhaps we could set up something in Durban around that.
That would be great. That would be great. Because I think last time we were a bit frustrated trying to help during the floods through the city. And we just didn't have room to do that. The city wanted to do procurement, etc., etc. We said, no, we actually could do a lot of free work. And then politically you could see that the whole thing was controlled and everything like that. I think working with the organization outside of government could help us. And then the government could actually catch up.
Yeah, and we have good relationships with some of the local government officials, and we often invite them to our sessions. We don't leave them out, but we're not waiting for them to lead. In other presentations, I didn't do it here because I thought it would just be a bit silly, but in other presentations, I often have a slide where I say, and the Durban Coalition would like to thank their funders, and I put up a totally blank slide. All of this work has been done with no dedicated funding. This is literally volunteers, civil society organizations finding a tiny pot here and there, if we have to provide some food at a community hall when we're meeting, etc. So, we don't have to wait for a funded project either. There are things that we can do. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. I think your talk spoke a lot towards our humanity part than our technical expertise this morning, which is very, very important. We'll be in touch then, Dr. Erwin, and thank you once again for the talk.
Thank you, everyone. Good to be here with you today.
Please send us your email address, Gary.
I'll do that now.
Will do. Okay. Thank you, everyone. I wish you all a
Thanks,
very
Gary.
good
All the
weekend.
best. Cheers. Bye.
See you on the next one. Thanks you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.